The empty mansion. The Caldwell estate stood on the edge of a rolling countryside, its white stone walls gleaming against the morning sun, vast and impressive, but hollow in ways no architecture could disguise. Inside, echoes traveled faster than footsteps, bouncing off marbled corridors and chandeliers that rarely lit up for company. For years, this mansion had been kept immaculate, polished daily, yet it felt like a stage set abandoned between performances. Jonathan Caldwell, a millionaire known for his sharp instincts in finance, had built his empire by trading long hours of presence for short bursts of power. His world was structured in timetables, efficiency reports, and constant meetings. But the one thing his ordered spreadsheets could never balance was the growing loneliness of his only son, Michael. Michael was only 7, but he carried the weight of grief like an old man. His mother had passed 2 years earlier, and Jonathan, unable to process his own sorrow, had drowned himself in work. Michael spent most of his days under the watchful eye of tutors, therapists, and caretakers, people paid handsomely to perform tasks, but none brave enough to step beyond the lines of their job description. That changed the day Grace entered the mansion. Grace Williams was not what Jonathan expected when the agency sent over a maid. She was in her late 20s, her warm brown skin contrasting with the cold silver decor of the Caldwell home. Her presence radiated something the house had long forgotten: life. She carried herself with dignity, her eyes calm but searching, and while her uniform was plain, she wore it like it belonged to someone proud of their work, not ashamed of it. At first, Jonathan had barely acknowledged her. In his mind, she was there to clean and maintain, to preserve the sterile perfection he believed was necessary for discipline. But Grace had her own quiet philosophy. She had once been the older sister to a younger brother, who suffered a condition that left him unable to walk without support. Years of helping him had taught her patience, resilience, and the understanding that healing was not just about medicine, it was about heart. On her 3rd day in the Caldwell estate, she found Michael in the garden. He was struggling with a soccer ball, his thin frame too hesitant to kick it properly. He tried, missed, tried again, and then simply sat down on the grass, muttering, "I can't do anything right." Grace knelt beside him, not with pity but with curiosity. "Who told you that, little man?" she asked gently. Michael looked up, surprised. His tutors usually corrected him, redirected him, or instructed him, but nobody ever asked. "Daddy doesn't say it. But he doesn't need to. He always looks disappointed when he sees me." Grace smiled softly. Sometimes adults get so busy chasing the world that they forget to look at what's already in front of them. "But you," she tapped the ball lightly with her foot, "you're stronger than you know. Want me to show you something my brother taught me?" And so it began. Each day after her official chores, Grace found little moments to be near Michael. Not in the way a teacher schedules lessons, but like a friend sneaking time between duties. She showed him how to steady his kicks by planting his feet. She encouraged him to draw not for approval but for joy. She listened when he spoke of missing his mother, not with the silence of avoidance but with the openness of someone who understood that wounds don't vanish just because we hide them. What Grace didn't know was that upstairs, in the quiet of his office, Jonathan sometimes paused mid-call. Through the window, he could hear faint laughter drifting from the garden. It startled him, because it had been years since that sound had echoed within these walls. And though he told himself it was harmless, a professional maid simply being kind, something in him tightened, an unease he didn't want to name. Jonathan was supposed to be gone for another 2 weeks on business, yet life has a way of changing plans. A canceled meeting in London meant he boarded an earlier flight home. He didn't tell anyone, not even his staff. He wanted to see things as they were without the polished facade of preparation. It was a tactic that had made him millions in negotiations, but in his own home, it was about to uncover something he never expected. On a bright Thursday morning, his car pulled into the driveway, tires crunching against gravel. He stepped out in a tailored navy suit, briefcase in hand, and walked toward the mansion's entrance. But halfway up the path, a sound froze him in place. It was his son's laugh. Not the small, polite laugh he gave tutors, nor the restrained smile he sometimes offered Jonathan at the dinner table. This was loud, carefree, bubbling from the core of a child who had forgotten pain for a moment. Jonathan followed the sound, drawn by a mixture of shock and something he dared not name: hope. He rounded the corner of the garden and stopped. There, on the damp grass, Michael stood barefoot, balancing carefully as Grace held his hands just above his shoulders, not supporting but guiding. She wasn't lifting him, wasn't forcing him, just hovering nearby with a steady patience that told him, "You can do this, but I'm here if you fall." Michael took a step, then another, his little arms out like wings. His face was bright with triumph. "I'm doing it, Grace. I'm really doing it." Grace laughed with him, her voice like sunlight warming cold stone. "Yes, you are, champ. You're stronger than you think. Look at you." And then it happened. Jonathan's voice, sharp as broken glass, cut through the garden. "What is going on here?" The laughter stopped instantly. Michael stumbled, nearly falling, but Grace caught his arm gently. She looked up to see Jonathan standing stiff, his jaw clenched, his eyes burning with questions and something else. Fear. Michael, trembling, whispered the words that would change everything. "Daddy, she's helping me." The confrontation Jonathan Caldwell had always prided himself on control, the kind of unshakable discipline that could bend markets and make men fold in negotiations. In boardrooms, his silence was enough to command respect. His sharp tone could redirect million-dollar decisions. But in that garden where dew still clung to the grass and his son's laughter had just been ringing like music, Jonathan felt something break inside him. He had come home expecting the usual, the house in perfect order, the staff moving with mechanical precision, his son quietly obeying the structure he had put in place. Instead, he had found this, his son barefoot in the grass, standing taller than Jonathan had ever seen him. And the maid, the woman he barely acknowledged, crouched beside him as though she belonged in that role of guide and protector. His voice had cut across the scene like thunder. Michael had faltered, fear flashing across his little face, and Grace had instinctively steadied him. That simple gesture, her hand near his son's arm, her eyes soft with encouragement, ignited something fierce in Jonathan. It was not only anger, though anger came quickly. It was also a piercing ache, an unbearable reminder of Catherine, his late wife, who used to kneel in this very garden with Michael when he was smaller. Catherine had believed in gentleness, in laughter, in healing that could not be bought. And Jonathan, unable to bear the memory of her absence, had buried himself in schedules and control. Now, seeing Grace take that space, seeing his son look at her with the same trust he once gave Catherine, Jonathan felt cornered by ghosts. "What is going on here?" His words echoed louder the second time, and the sharpness made even the birds scatter from the nearby hedges. Grace rose slowly, steadying Michael before she straightened her uniform. She did not cower. She did not stammer. She simply met his eyes with quiet steadiness, though Jonathan could see the pulse racing at her throat. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, her tone calm but not submissive. "Your son was practicing walking on uneven ground. He's doing well, better than I've ever seen." Michael, still clutching at his balance, tried to interject, his small voice trembling. "Daddy, please don't be mad. She was helping me, that's all. I can walk farther now, I swear." His earnest eyes pleaded for recognition, for approval that had always been scarce. But Jonathan was too tangled in his own emotions to answer. He stepped forward, his polished shoes sinking slightly into the wet soil, and gestured sharply for Grace to step away. "You were hired to clean, not to interfere. Do you understand? You're not his therapist. You're not qualified. I pay professionals for his care, not this." He waved a hand, dismissing the fragile triumph his son had just achieved. Grace's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but she did not move back. "With respect, sir, Michael wasn't asking for qualifications. He was asking for encouragement. And sometimes that's worth more than professional routines." Jonathan froze, not used to being spoken to that way, least of all by an employee. In his world, people did not challenge him. They nodded, they obeyed, they waited until his back was turned before whispering their opinions. But Grace had said it plainly, without insult, without fear, and that made her words harder to dismiss. Still, pride flared in him. "You are overstepping your role," he snapped. "If you think you can undermine the structure I've built for my son, you are mistaken. He needs discipline, not indulgence." It was then that Michael's voice, small but trembling with courage, broke through. "No, Daddy." Jonathan turned sharply, eyes narrowing, but his son did not back down. Michael's crutches lay forgotten on the grass, and though his knees wobbled, he stood taller than Jonathan had ever seen. She helps me in ways nobody else does. She listens to me. She believes I can do things, not just follow exercises. With her, I feel strong, not broken." The last word hung heavy in the air, more devastating than any accusation. Jonathan felt it like a blow to his chest. Broken. His son thought of himself as broken, despite all the money Jonathan had poured into specialists' machines and programs. He had thought his wealth could buy away the fractures in their lives. But here was the truth laid bare by a child's trembling voice. Grace knelt down beside Michael again, steadying him with the lightest touch. "You are not broken," she whispered fiercely, loud enough for Jonathan to hear. "You are whole. You are brave, and you will walk as far as you dream, not because of money, but because you have the heart for it." Jonathan's hands clenched into fists. He should have fired her on the spot. Every instinct told him to reclaim control, to end this defiance before it unraveled the structure of his home. Yet he could not move. His eyes betrayed him, drifting to Michael, whose face glowed with a pride Jonathan had never seen before. It was the pride of a child who had conquered something real, not just completed a scheduled exercise. The sight made Jonathan's throat tighten, though he fought it down. "Inside, now," Jonathan ordered, his voice low but sharp. Grace began to guide Michael toward the house, but Michael twisted back, desperate. "Daddy, please don't send her away. She's my friend. She makes me laugh. Don't take her from me." The words cracked under the weight of his tears, and Jonathan had to turn away, ashamed at the sudden sting in his own eyes. They walked back into the mansion, silence heavy between them. In the grand foyer, where marble gleamed under crystal light, Jonathan dismissed the other staff with a wave. The butler, the cook, the gardener, they vanished down the corridors, leaving only Jonathan, Grace, and Michael in the cavernous space. Jonathan stood by the staircase, hands gripping the polished rail, his mind a storm. Grace stood opposite, her hands folded in front of her apron, steady though Jonathan knew she expected the worst. Michael clung to her side, refusing to let go. Finally, Jonathan spoke, his voice quieter but no less intense. "Do you understand what you've done? You've crossed lines that were not yours to cross. I brought you here to maintain order, and instead you filled my son's head with attachments, with ideas that do not belong." Grace looked at him, her eyes soft but unyielding. "Mr. Caldwell, forgive me, but children are not businesses. They cannot be run by schedules alone. Your son doesn't need another therapist. He needs someone to see him, and right now he feels seen, maybe for the first time in years." Jonathan's breath caught. The words cut close, too close. He wanted to deny them, to remind her of her position, but deep down he knew she was right, and that terrified him. Because if she was right, then it meant he had failed his son not through lack of money or resources, but through absence of heart. He turned away, walking toward his study, his footsteps echoing. "We'll speak later," he said stiffly. "For now, leave me." But before Grace could move, Michael cried out, his voice breaking like a dam. "No, don't send her away. If you make her go, I'll never forgive you." The words, fierce and desperate, ricocheted through the mansion. Jonathan froze in the doorway, his back rigid. No one, not even his toughest rivals, had ever spoken to him with such raw defiance. And yet this was his son, the boy he thought he was protecting, standing against him to keep a maid by his side. For the first time in years, Jonathan did not know what to say, and so the confrontation ended not with dismissal, nor with resolution, but with silence, thick, suffocating silence that promised the battle was only beginning. The breaking point that night, the Caldwell mansion felt heavier than usual, its marble corridors echoing with silence rather than footsteps. The confrontation in the garden lingered in every corner like smoke after a fire. Jonathan retreated into his study, the great oak desk buried under contracts and reports, though his eyes never focused on the words in front of him. He poured himself a drink, amber liquid catching the glow of the desk lamp, but even that small comfort tasted bitter. For the first time in years, Jonathan Caldwell, the man who built empires with logic and discipline, felt powerless. Not because of markets or rivals, but because of a maid and his own son's desperate words ringing in his ears. "If you make her go, I'll never forgive you." He sat back in his chair, staring at the large portrait on the wall. Catherine's painted face looked down at him with soft eyes that seemed to accuse him silently. She had always said their son needed warmth more than wealth, but Jonathan had dismissed it as sentimentality. He told himself children grew strong through discipline, that comfort made them weak. Yet what had his cold structure built? a little boy who thought of himself as broken, who had to borrow courage from a stranger in order to feel whole. Meanwhile, in the staff wing, Grace lay awake on her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling. She knew she should feel afraid. Millionaires did not tolerate disobedience from their employees, but instead she felt something closer to sadness. She had seen too many children like Michael, children with enough material comfort to fill a dozen lives, yet starved of the one thing they needed most, someone who listened without judgment. Grace thought of her younger brother Caleb, of the nights she spent beside his hospital bed, teaching him to laugh at silly stories even when his legs refused to move. She had promised herself she would never walk away from a child who needed that kind of presence. But staying here meant risking her job, maybe even her safety. Still, she whispered into the darkness, "I can't abandon him now. He's only just begun to believe in himself." Michael did not sleep easily either. In his room, he clutched the crutches by his bedside, staring out at the moonlight spilling across the lawn where he had walked with Grace. He feared his father's anger, but more than that, he feared losing the only person who had made him feel proud of himself. In his short life, he had already learned what it was to be alone in a house full of people, but tonight the thought of that loneliness returning was unbearable. Quietly, he whispered to the empty room, "Please don't let Daddy send her away. Please let her stay." The next morning, tension wrapped the mansion tighter than the cold morning fog outside. Jonathan appeared at the breakfast table, impeccably dressed as always, but his silence was sharp enough to cut glass. Michael sat opposite him, pushing food around his plate without eating, while Grace quietly set dishes at the sideboard, her posture calm, though she felt every ounce of strain in the air. Jonathan finally broke the silence, his eyes on his son, but his words aimed at her. "Michael, your schedule will return to normal today. Tutors, therapy, lessons. No more distractions." Michael's fork clattered onto the plate, his small hands trembling. "She's not a distraction. She's the only one who believes I can do more than what's written in your schedules." The outburst shocked even him, his cheeks flushing red, but he didn't back down. His eyes burned with something Jonathan had never seen before, defiance mixed with desperation. Grace stood very still, her heart pounding. She wanted to step in, to protect Michael from the weight of Jonathan's disapproval, but she also knew the boy needed this moment. He needed to speak his truth. Jonathan, however, could not bear the sting of those words. He slammed his hand on the table, the sound reverberating through the cavernous dining room. "Enough!" he thundered. "You will not speak to me that way. I am your father, and what I say is final." The silence that followed was deafening. Michael's lips trembled, but then he stood, wobbling on his weak legs, and said something that broke the fortress Jonathan had built around himself. "Maybe you're my father," he whispered, voice shaking. "But she's the one who makes me feel like I have a family." His words cracked as tears filled his eyes, but he didn't sit down. He stood there, fragile yet unyielding, as if daring his father to shatter him completely. Jonathan stared at him, stunned. Never in all his life had anyone dared to speak to him like that. Not business partners, not employees, not even rivals. And now his own son was standing against him, not for toys or privileges, but for love. He looked at Grace then, really looked, and for the first time he saw not just a maid in uniform, but a woman carrying a strength he had ignored. A strength that was quietly healing the wound he himself had let fester in his child. He pushed back from the table, his chair scraping loudly against the marble floor. Without another word, he strode from the room, his footsteps echoing down the hall. He needed air, space, anything to escape the storm inside him. Grace exhaled slowly, steadying herself, then turned to Michael. She knelt, brushing away the tears on his cheeks with the corner of her apron. "You were brave," she whispered. "So very brave." Michael leaned against her, exhausted from the confrontation. "I don't want to lose you," he murmured. Grace held him tighter, her heart breaking at his fear. "You won't lose me," she promised, though she wasn't sure if she could keep that promise. Millionaires could dismiss staff with a word, and Jonathan Caldwell was a man who rarely reconsidered his decisions. But as she held Michael in that moment, she made a silent vow. If Jonathan forced her out, she would still find a way to be there for this child. Later that afternoon, Jonathan found himself wandering into the West Wing, a part of the mansion he rarely entered. His eyes fell on a closed music room, untouched since Catherine's passing. Something compelled him to open the door. Dust clung to the piano lid, but he remembered the nights Catherine used to play. Michael gurgling in her lap, laughter filling the room. He pressed a key absent-mindedly, and the note rang out, hollow but haunting. For the first time in years, Jonathan felt the sharp sting of regret. Not the kind you push aside with work, but the kind that anchors itself deep in the soul. He realized then that he was on the brink of losing more than control. He was on the brink of losing his son's trust entirely. That evening, he stood at his study window, watching the garden where Michael and Grace had once laughed together. Pride urged him to fire her, to restore order, but something deeper held him back. He could not ignore the truth. Grace had given his son something he himself could not. The breaking point had come, not in the clash of voices, not in the slamming of fists, but in the quiet realization that his empire meant nothing if his son no longer looked at him with love. And though Jonathan did not yet know what to do, he understood one thing clearly. If he kept pushing against Grace, he might win the battle of authority, but he would lose his son forever. The choice. The next day dawned gray and heavy, as though even the sky sensed the storm brewing inside the Caldwell mansion. Jonathan sat in his study long before sunrise, unable to rest, his thoughts churning like a restless sea. On his desk lay contracts worth millions, projects demanding his signature, but his pen remained untouched. He stared instead at the empty leather chair opposite him, the one Catherine used to occupy when she insisted he bring work home, but refused to let him disappear behind it. She had always believed a house was meant for laughter, not silence, for family, not just discipline. Now her absence loomed in every corner, and Jonathan realized that despite all his control, he had failed to preserve what mattered most. Yet pride is a stubborn thing. A lifetime of power and authority had shaped Jonathan into a man who did not yield easily, not to competitors, not to critics, and certainly not to his employees. And Grace, quiet, determined Grace, had become more than an employee. She had become a mirror, reflecting his failures in a way he could not ignore. That unsettled him more than her defiance, because it forced him to confront truths he had spent years burying under work. Michael sensed the tension. He avoided breakfast altogether, slipping instead into the garden where the air felt freer. He walked with his crutches along the damp stones, each step deliberate, each wobble corrected by the lessons Grace had shown him. He imagined her voice guiding him. Lean forward a little, trust your weight, don't fear the stumble. And though she was not there, the memory steadied him. For the first time, he felt not like a boy trapped in a body that betrayed him, but like someone learning how to command his own strength. Grace found him there not long after, her apron dusted with flour from the kitchen. She slowed her steps, careful not to intrude, but Michael turned at once, his face brightening. "Look," he said, determination shining in his young eyes. "I can walk farther today. I've been practicing." Grace's heart swelled as she watched him take careful steps across the uneven ground, pausing, then continuing. His pride was radiant, untainted by fear, and she knew it was not just his legs that were growing stronger. It was his spirit. But in the shadows of the veranda, Jonathan stood unseen, watching. He had come to demand that Grace pack her things, convinced that removing her would restore order. Yet what he saw stopped him cold. Michael moving forward step by step, not because of a therapist or a carefully scheduled program, but because of faith, because someone had believed in him. Jonathan's throat tightened as he realized the cruel irony. He had spent fortunes on professionals, yet the progress he was witnessing came from the free gift of encouragement. Later that afternoon, Jonathan summoned Grace to his study. The room was dim, blinds drawn against the midday light, and the air smelled faintly of cigar smoke. Grace entered quietly, her hands folded before her, her face calm though she felt the weight of his scrutiny. Jonathan gestured toward the chair across from him. "Sit." His tone was clipped, professional, as though she were an executive about to be reprimanded in a board meeting. She obeyed, settling into the chair without fidgeting. Jonathan studied her in silence for a long moment, as though trying to measure the woman who had disrupted his ordered world. Finally, he spoke. "Do you know what you've done?" His voice was low, edged with restrained anger. "You've undermined me in my own home. You've crossed boundaries that were never yours to cross. You were hired to clean, not to raise my son." Grace met his eyes without flinching, With respect, Mr. Caldwell, I wasn't trying to undermine you. I was trying to help a little boy who believes he's broken. I couldn't stand by and polish silver while he carried that weight alone. Her words were simple, but her tone carried a conviction Jonathan could not dismiss. His jaw tightened. You presume too much. Michael is my responsibility. And yet, Grace replied softly, he came to me with pain he could not share with you. That's not because he doesn't love you, sir, it's because he's afraid of disappointing you. He thinks your love depends on him fitting into the schedule you created. But children don't thrive on schedules alone. They thrive on being seen, on being heard, on being loved without condition. Jonathan's chest ached with unspoken truths. He wanted to argue, to remind her of her place, but he found no words sharp enough to cut through her quiet certainty. Instead, he stood abruptly, pacing toward the window. His reflection stared back at him in the glass, a man in a flawless suit who looked powerful but felt hollow. You speak boldly for someone who could be dismissed this instant, he muttered. Grace rose from her chair, her voice steady though her heart raced. Then dismiss me if that's what you must do. But know this, if you send me away, you're not punishing me. You're punishing your son, and one day when he looks back, he won't remember the wealth you gave him. He'll remember that the one person who believed in him was taken from him by the man he needed most. The words struck like a blade. Jonathan turned, his face pale, his hands gripping the edge of the desk as though to steady himself. For a moment he looked less like a millionaire and more like a father who had lost his way. At that moment the study door creaked open. Michael stood there, clutching his crutches, his face pale but determined. Don't fire her, Daddy, he said, his voice trembling but resolute. Please. If you do, you'll break me in a way no one can fix. The silence that followed was unbearable. Jonathan's breath caught in his chest, torn between pride and love, between control and surrender. He saw in his son's eyes a reflection of Catherine's spirit, the same spirit that once challenged him to choose family over fortune. And for the first time, Jonathan felt the walls of his fortress cracking. Grace reached for Michael's hand, steadying him, and Jonathan knew the truth he had been resisting. This was no longer about authority. It was about choice. He could cling to his pride or he could choose his son. He could send Grace away and preserve the illusion of control, or he could let her stay and risk confronting the pain he had buried. Jonathan turned back to the window, the decision heavy on his shoulders. The choice he made in that moment would not only shape his son's future, but also determine whether he remained a father in name or became one in truth. And in the stillness of that dim room, Jonathan Caldwell realized that for once in his life, money, power, and control could not decide for him. Only love could. The transformation. The mansion was unnaturally quiet after the confrontation in Jonathan's study, the kind of silence that carries more weight than words. Grace had withdrawn to her quarters, unsure if her honesty had cost her the job, while Michael lingered in his room, restless, waiting for a verdict he dreaded to hear. Jonathan himself remained in the study long after dusk, pacing the carpet as though the movement could untangle the knots inside his chest. For years he had been a man of swift decisions, never hesitating when millions were at stake. Yet now, faced with the plea of his son and the unshakable truth of a maid's words, he found himself paralyzed. Outside, the night pressed against the windows, the moonlight spilling silver across the garden where only days ago his son had laughed for the first time in years. Jonathan could still hear it in his memory, bright and unrestrained, so different from the quiet compliance he had mistaken for progress. That laugh had not come from a therapy session or a tutor's lesson. It had come from Grace's belief, from her presence, from her refusal to see Michael as broken. And the thought tore through Jonathan like lightning. He had spent fortunes trying to fix what wasn't broken at all. His son had never needed to be remade. He had only needed to be loved. By morning, the weight of his decision sat heavy but clear. Jonathan rose earlier than usual, not in a suit but in a simple shirt and trousers, his tie left forgotten. He walked to Michael's room, and for the first time in months he did not knock as a visitor might, but entered as a father. Michael was awake, sitting on the edge of his bed with crutches nearby. His small face tensed when he saw Jonathan, as though bracing for the worst. But Jonathan crossed the room, knelt before him, and took his son's hands into his own. "Michael," he said quietly, his voice raw in a way the boy had never heard, "I've been wrong. I thought giving you the best doctors and the best tutors was enough. I thought if I built a schedule, you'd be safe. But I forgot the most important thing. I forgot that you don't need perfection. You need me, and you need people who see you for who you are, not who I want you to be." His throat tightened, but he forced the words through. "Grace isn't going anywhere. Not unless you want her to." For a moment, Michael could only stare, stunned. Then, tears filling his eyes, he threw his arms around his father's neck. Jonathan held him close, breathing in the fragile, fierce love he had nearly lost. It had been so long since he had held his son without fear of breaking him, so long since he had let himself simply be a father, rather than a manager of his child's life. Later that day, Jonathan found Grace in the kitchen, her apron still on, her eyes wary as he entered. She expected dismissal, perhaps even cold words. Instead, Jonathan stopped in the doorway, searching for language that didn't sound like an order or an accusation. "Grace," he said finally, his voice softer than she had ever heard. "Thank you. I don't know how to say this without sounding inadequate, but you've given my son something I could not. You gave him laughter. You gave him belief. You gave him hope. For that I owe you more than I can ever repay." Grace's eyes softened, though she did not boast or bow. She simply answered with quiet sincerity, "I didn't give him anything he didn't already have, Mr. Caldwell. I only reminded him it was there." Her humility struck him more deeply than any rebuke could have. He realized then that her strength lay not in challenging him for power, but in serving with love so steady it had changed the rhythm of his entire household. From that day forward, the Caldwell mansion no longer echoed with emptiness. Jonathan began to restructure his life, not by abandoning his work. He was still a businessman, still driven, but by learning to step away when his son needed him. He started small, joining Michael in the garden for practice, applauding each step not with a businessman's approval, but with a father's pride. The first time he heard Michael's laughter again, this time directed at him as well as Grace, Jonathan felt something loosen in his chest. It was not just relief. It was redemption. Grace remained not just as a maid but as a quiet pillar in their lives. She continued to guide Michael, but now with Jonathan's blessing rather than his resistance. And slowly a bond grew between the three of them. Not the rigid structure Jonathan had tried to enforce, nor the fragile secrecy of before, but something real and alive. A family rebuilt not by money but by courage, trust, and love. One evening, months later, Jonathan stood at the window of the music room, watching as Grace and Michael sat at the piano together. Grace pressed the keys softly, teaching Michael a simple tune while his boy's laughter rose above the notes. For the first time in years, Jonathan didn't feel like a widower trapped in a mausoleum of wealth. He felt like a father, like a man given a second chance. And as Michael turned, smiling wide, his voice carried across the room, pure and unguarded, "Daddy, come play with us." Jonathan hesitated only for a moment before stepping forward, sitting beside them on the bench. The three of them crowded together over the piano, laughter filling the mansion where silence had once reigned. It was then Jonathan understood the truth Catherine had always known. Sometimes the family you need isn't the one you design or control, but the one that rises from love when you dare to let your guard fall. And as his son's laughter filled his ears, Jonathan knew he had finally chosen right. Not as a millionaire, but as a father.